everywhere podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of today's show, we take a transition into the world of Sunday Night Football. Bucs-Cowboys here. And it's going to be an interesting game because of these two teams' styles of play. When we look at the Bucs, I do feel that the performance against the Los Angeles Chargers last week was very telling of what this Bucs team could potentially be once they get into the postseason, how dangerous that passing game is with Baker Mayfield playing his swashbuckling brand of football combined with the elite consistency that is Mike Evans. But then I look at this Cowboys team, right? And the reason why they were my favorite starts of the week here at the defense position is because of their defensive turnaround, complemented with Cooper Rush's free nature in that offense. This team has become a tough out down the stretch, even though they're not necessarily playing for anything but pride. And I feel like combined with this unexpected nature of what Tampa is week in, week out, I feel like this game's going to be a lot more entertaining than people think. And I feel like, even though the Bucs had that impressive win last week, the Cowboys can keep this close because of what they're able to do with a guy like Micah Parsons and how he creates space for other playmakers like DeMarcus Lawrence, Ozzie Odighizuwa in this defense. But yet, Vegas does still think Tampa Bay are the favorites here. They're the 4-point favorites here. The over-under is 48.5. They're projecting a kind of high-scoring game, not necessarily, one that really is going to be that exciting in terms of offenses putting up points consistently, but it's still pretty high for this level of game. Dallas plus 120, or plus 170 rather, in terms of money lines, and Tampa Bay minus 200 in terms of money lines there. So as you can see, Vegas, from a betting standpoint, still on the side of Tampa here. But I still think that you can't discount the Cowboys and what they're able to do. Because when I think about this particular matchup and where both of these teams are this season, Tampa Bay could, for all intents and purposes, have been in the Cowboys' position, and the Cowboys, for all intents and purposes, could have been in Tampa Bay's position as a feisty team that you don't want to play in the playoffs. And Tampa Bay could have been a team similarly as feisty, but outside of the playoff picture trying to play spoiler. And so that's what makes this game, from a betting perspective, so hard to think about. I still think when you look at these teams on paper, right, the Bucs still have a lot more talent, even despite the fact that Chris Godwin isn't amongst his receiving core right now. I still think they've done a good job with the talent as well. Liam Cohen's underrated style of play really brings out the best in guys that might have been a little bit unheralded at certain times this season. Guys like Jalen McMillan, guys like Cade Otton, guys like Sean Tucker, Bucky Irving in the backfield. And so that's what makes this team so multifaceted and thus so dangerous to go up against. And that's why I feel like I would lean a little bit more towards Tampa Bay in this setting. Also because of the fact that Baker Mayfield, when he's playing like he played last week, is someone who can't be ignored. I know a lot of people discount his style of play as too freewheeling. Some people describe it as a little bit too reckless. But ultimately, in this offense, it works perfectly, combined with the trust Liam Cohen has in him and the trust Baker is developing with these new weapons. And so that's why it hasn't really lost a step, despite the fact, that glaring hole Chris Godwin leaves behind might come back to bite them. And then the Cowboys side of things, I just can't get past the fact that, despite the fact that this defense has turned around, despite the fact the offense looks a little bit more comfortable under Cooper Rush's leadership here, I do feel that this Cowboys team still has a little bit of a disconnect between itself and the organization. What I mean by that is this organization seeps too much into the mindset of this football team, has too much influence over the mindset of this football team in certain ways that kind of distracts it from truly performing to its level of standards, which is a feisty football team. Maybe not a feisty football team from a Tampa Bay standpoint, but still a feisty football team, nevertheless. And so, when I look at this game, I want to say that Tampa Bay wins this one comfortably, just because of the things I described. But I have to give the Cowboys credit here, because despite all the turmoil, externally and internally, they still have put out a product that has improved steadily, knows what it has, and is prepared for the long-term future of this team. And even though a large part of that kind of lost its luster when Dak went down because of the fact this team is now in many ways intrinsically linked to that contract, I still do think that we're getting glimpses of what the best of this Cowboys team can be. And so that's why when I look at this game and how these two teams set up, the Cowboys can come in this a little bit more unafraid than the Bucs feel. And so I feel like when I describe these two teams, there's too many similarities to say that Tampa Bay will cover the spread. With that being said, I do feel like Tampa Bay is one of those teams capable of pulling away from a team like the Cowboys. When I look at the Cowboys these past couple of weeks, and I look at the improvements they made on third down defense, on limiting explosive plays, there are little lapses. And it's not necessarily like these lapses are completely on the defense or completely on one side of the football. It's just lapses where you kind of feel like they're disconnected in certain crucial moments of the game. And that's why I feel like Tampa Bay, playing as hot as they are, could take advantage of that. But I still think, say, around the late fourth quarter, this could be a one-score game where the Cowboys control their own fate in it. And it's going to come down to, right, those critical moments. Because I feel like Tampa Bay's execution of those critical moments goes unsaid. Yes, it's funny to say that when they have two losses to their division rival in overtime moments and moments of crucial importance, but they have had impressive drives, like the one against the Panthers a couple weeks ago. And, even to get the game against the Chiefs to overtime was very impressive. So, I do feel like this Bucs team has a little bit more decisiveness in those moments, a little bit more urgency in those moments. And I want to see if the Cowboys will be able to match that urgency a little bit more. Because when all is said and done, I feel like in the matchup of these two teams, one team completely out of the race but still playing spoiler, one team deep in the thick of the race playing very hot, I feel like those two conflicts are going to complement each other to the point where it's going to come down to final decisions in the final moments of the game. And I feel like what with the Bucs' multiplicity on offense, their different ways to kill a game off, whether it be through the running game, whether it be through Baker Mayfield relying on these lesser weapons, I feel like the Bucs just have a little bit more. Whereas the Cowboys, kind of shoot themselves in the foot a little bit too much. Sometimes, luck goes their way, much like they did against the Commanders. And so, I feel like luck, though, is not necessarily going to always happen when you're a team like the Cowboys. And I've seen it all season long, where they just can't be bothered in certain moments of the game, play pretty well, but ultimately let it slip. And then the Bucs, with all these games that they played really closely, have that late game experience. And so that's why I'm looking at this game. I'm going to talk about the importance of certain players from a fantasy perspective in our last segment here. But I do feel like this Bucs team won't matter what people think about it from a fantasy standpoint. because they know that production can come from the unlikeliest of weapons. I feel like when I talk about the fantasy, it's going to be weird to say certain players might have to be avoided. But ultimately, I feel like you can interpret this game any way you want because of what these two teams can bring to the table. And then, for my final prediction here, I'm going to have to say the Cowboys cover. And I don't necessarily feel like that's a statement that will favor me by this game's end. But I do feel like the Cowboys will just lose it in a moment where the Bucs, being the hotter, feistier team, just want it more. And I do feel like, this Bucs team might keep this Cowboys team around longer than you would think, because I haven't talked about this defense, and this defense is pretty middling by certain standards. They have the weapons on that defensive side of the football, but I don't necessarily know if they're going to be limiting the Cowboys on what they can do in certain situations. So that's why I feel that the Cowboys can stick around in this one for longer than people think, but ultimately lose their heads in late game situations. And ultimately the Bucs will take advantage of that. And then, before we go into break, I want to address a comment from Tap to Learn. Cowboys will never max out with Dak at the helm. I'm not necessarily certain they will either, but I do feel like, from what I've seen this season, they now have a little more optimism and freedom than it looked like they had early in the season. And yes, while you make the point, and this next comment here about not staying on the field, I do feel like, they have contingency plans in place where they feel comfortable they can get the best out of this team. It might not be the prettiest of plans, but still a plan in which the Cowboys can still play a little bit more freely than they would before the contract, so to speak. Because now the contract is over, they can take a deep exhale. And that's why I feel like, as he also suggests, they could poke the Eagles in the eyes in the next couple of weeks, and I hope they poke the Commanders' eyes as well, depending on Seattle's situation. But ultimately, that's where the Cowboys are right now. They're a kind of enigmatic team heading down the stretch who potentially be a surprise team, but potentially lose their luster and lose their heads in certain moments. But let me know what you think about this game a little bit more as we talk about it from a fantasy perspective in our last segment, coming up after this short break.